What does the world look like after Gaza? The acclaimed essayist, historian, and author Pankaj Mishra has tried to answer that question in his new book by taking us back into the past century of Israeli militarism, American imperialism, Western colonialism, the Holocaust and its aftermath, and every type of supremacy from white to Jewish to Hindu. The book is called The World After Gaza, and it's out now. And the author joins us now. Pankaj Mishra, thank you for joining me on Mehdi Unfiltered.
Thank you, Mehdi.
So, in the beginning of your book, you talk about your quote, indebtedness to Jewish thinkers, and how for so long, despite seeing the blatant oppression of the Palestinians, it was hard for you to, quote, resist the Zionist logic. So I'm curious, Pankaj, how did you, someone who was born, raised, educated in India, how did you come to this issue of Palestine, of Gaza, and end up taking a stance that many would say is provocative, contentious?
Well, it was a tortuous journey in the sense that I grew up in a family of Hindu nationalists who were always extremely sympathetic to Zionism. They were also sympathetic to Nazism at the same time, which is, interesting in its own way. But I think, that broadly speaking, they were sympathetic to the idea of a very strong sense of nationality. And they thought that Israel had cultivated that successfully and was a strong militaristic state that sponsored a very, very, very strong sense of belonging among its citizens. And that's something we in India should emulate. So I grew up, essentially thinking of Israeli military heroes as people that we should be emulating in India. And then, of course, I came into contact with Palestinian students at university.
And then your view starts to change.
My view started to change, and obviously I started to read a lot more in the history of Palestine, of the Middle East broadly, and came to realize that this was a far more complicated issue than I had childishly imagined.
And it's, of course, not just Israel that looms large in the imagination of nationalists and supporters of the Jewish state, but also the Holocaust. And your book really centers around how Israel in the West remembers the Holocaust, which you say has now been weaponized against opponents of Israel. Is it your view that Israel and its allies abroad have misunderstood the Holocaust, have taken a superficial understanding of the lessons of the Holocaust, or that they're just cynically using it as a shield?
Well, I think, the people who first pointed to the cynical exploitation of the Holocaust were the survivors of the Holocaust. They could see very clearly from the 50s, 60s onwards. I mean, these are people who had struggled to make their experience resonate, for people to listen to them. They had really struggled for audiences back in the 50s and 60s. Again, this is a point, it's really important to make that the Holocaust was not institutionalized in so many national cultures. It was much later. It was deliberately
Post-67 war.
Post-67, little bit before that, but then it was a very deliberate construction. And the survivors of the Holocaust were shocked, and these are people I write about in my book, at the way the state of Israel had appropriated that memory and turned it into the service of a militant expansionist project.
You also write in the book about how when you first tried to write about Israel decades ago, you were quickly met with a lot of resistance from publications that otherwise would publish you happily. And you quickly noticed that, quote, those calling attention to the spectacle of Washington's blind commitment to Israel risked inviting a potentially destructive charge of anti-Semitism. And actually, last year, you kind of witnessed that firsthand because you write this essay in the London Review of Books about the Shoah after the Holocaust, the Shoah after Gaza. The Barbican was supposed to host a lecture by you, and I believe they then pulled out. Did they pull out voluntarily? Were they put under pressure to pull out? What was your reaction to that whole episode?
I'm not actually quite sure what happened there, at the Barbican, but they certainly pulled out at the last moment, fearing that they might also attract the same malicious charge of anti-Semitism. Yeah. This is a fear that governs, a lot of institutions, a lot of individuals, what they can say about this subject. And of course, we know that this accusation has been vulgarized and cheapened dangerously to the point where we are, for a lot of people, anti-Semitism is just something that is, the charge of anti-Semitism is just used to silence critics. But, this is something you just have to prepare yourself for when you write about this subject. And there are just a whole lot of taboos around this subject. And if you try to break them, you will be stigmatized, no question.
But you went into both the LRB essay and the book that's come out of it with eyes wide open that this charge would be used against you.
Look, Mehdi, I mean, I think, we've lived through like 15 months of extreme violence,
Yes.
accompanied by mendacity,
Yes.
deception on the part of Israel supporters. I think this is something, you can't really fear anymore. We've seen horrific things in the last 15 months. There is so much more to fear at this point than a charge of anti-Semitism.